Now, I don't know if I've been good this year, but if I have, Santa best be ready. Miami is on my wish list. This is a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Canes crossover.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to Locked On Big 12 and Locked On Canes. I'm Drake Toll from ESPN Central Texas. That is Alex Dono of Locked On Canes. And Dono, here we are. Thanks to everybody for making our shows your first listen every single day. We're in the middle of another expansion circus. And the big topic last week was Miami to the Big 12. I watched your show, and I'm honored to know that you watched my show. And the comment section, Dono, is what got me. These Canes fans who were really on both sides of the topic, both pro and anti, a Big 12 move. Let's start here, though. 30,000 level view for those who aren't familiar with this level of expansion. Is there a chance? Well, what is the chance? Miami's no longer in the ACC come the next 2 years.
If I believe everything that I read and hear on the internet, or hear around and read on the internet, it seems like Miami might be less likely to try to get out than the likes of Florida State, North Carolina, Clemson. I don't know if I put a lot of stock into that silence, though, Drake, because on this specific topic, when it comes to whether or not they're trying to get out of the ACC, Miami's been a lot more quiet. I think that there's been a concerted effort by Dan Radakovich, their athletic director, to keep those discussions primarily in-house. Because on the one hand, I don't hear maybe enough chatter that I'd like to hear about Miami trying to get out. Because when you talk about the comments from my viewers and listeners on Locked On Canes, one of the few things that Miami fans can all agree on is they don't like the ACC. You'd be hard pressed. You'd be hard pressed to find too many Miami fans who are like, "Yes, I love this terrible officiating. I love the absolute apathy by the leaders of the conference, and I love this terrible grant of rights deal and this awful TV revenue." You'd be hard pressed to find really more than one or two Canes fans who actually are happy where they are right now. But in terms of what Miami's doing, I would find it hard to believe that they're doing nothing, okay? Because, a couple years ago, the former athletic director was, a very quiet one who didn't really do a whole lot, didn't like to rattle the cage. But, then they went out last year and got the former Clemson athletic director who did a lot to help them build their athletic programs and their football program there. So I'd be hard pressed to believe that Miami is not at least exploring the options. And obviously you've seen the reports and rumors as I have. And to me, there's a big domino that would have to fall. Like, clearly, I don't think Miami wants to be the one that kind of sets the precedent for how to get out of the ACC. I think everyone's looking at Florida State as being either the guinea pig or the canary in the coal mine, however you want to look at it, that they're going to be the ones who maybe figure out how to get out, and then that's how the exodus would happen.
In this scenario, is there a way, in your opinion, Miami does get left out of the SEC or the Big Ten? That's to me, the only way Miami can go to the Big 12. And I do want to put, in response to what you said about the ACC, I'll reaffirm you. Texas, the 12-1 Big 12 champion, got in over Florida State, the undefeated ACC champion. Says a little bit about those two conferences. And to me, the Big 12 is not as top heavy as the ACC. In this scenario, is the Big 12 big enough to support a brand like Miami, or do they need the Big 10 of the SEC?
Well, let me start with what it would take to get into the SEC and the Big 10. I have been, for about the past year, of the opinion that between those two, we'll get to the Big 12, but between the Big 10 and the SEC, in some ways, Miami would actually be a better fit in the Big 10. The academic standards more aligned with Miami. Miami has the AAU designation as a research institute.
Whoa, what are you saying about the SEC, Dono? What do you think about the SEC?
You can interpret that however you want to.
You ever been to Fayetteville, Arkansas? Come on, Dono. You ever been there? Lexington, Kentucky.
But the Big Ten requires AAU distinction to get in, which is actually one of the things that may work against Florida State, who doesn't have that. If they try to get into the Big, they would have to work around that. The only school that doesn't have AAU designation in the Big Ten is Nebraska, but they had it when they got in. They lost it afterwards. So that's why they're the only one that doesn't fall into that category. As far as the SEC, honestly, I don't feel that optimistic about Miami ever getting into the SEC. And I think a big part of it is when you have these conference votes to let Miami in, recruiting plays a big factor in that, Drake.
Yes.
The South Florida area, just per capita, one of the richest recruiting grounds in the country. Alabama, Florida, love taking players from there. Auburn, so on and so on. They love going into South Florida and recruiting and getting big time recruits. Not to be the guy who's like sunshine pumping Miami's so great, this and that. But when it comes to recruiting South Florida, the SEC schools prefer that Miami is not part of the SEC. That way, they've got a big ace up their sleeve. When they come and recruit the top South Florida high schools, they can say, well, you could stay home and play for Miami, but, they're part of the ACC. Don't you want to come to the SEC? If they let Miami into the conference, they lose that trump card in recruiting. So I think that's a big factor. I think Miami would have a tough time getting voted in to the SEC. There are pros and cons to the Big Ten. I mean, okay, your academic standards may kind of fit the mission statement there, but the geography doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Not that it makes sense for teams from Los Angeles to be in it, but it's a crazy thing. Having to play all these games like in Ohio or Iowa in November would not be ideal for Miami. And you don't have traditional rivalries in place, right? I mean, if you were to go to the SEC, hypothetically, you get Florida as a semi-regular part of the schedule. Maybe if Miami and Florida State both go there, you can preserve those in-state rivalries. That wouldn't be something you would have in the Big Ten. So there are pros and cons to both. I think I'd probably feel slightly better about Miami's chances in getting to the Big Ten than the SEC, because there have been rumblings about that over the past year.
Yeah, sounds like the SEC is trying to target new TV markets if they do move into expansion. The prevalent rumor being a Virginia or a UNC. And for the Big Ten, they've kind of shown a no-holds-bar. Anybody who has the AAU distinction and is a big brand in college athletics will look at you. But in these rumblings, it sounds like the Big Ten and the SEC both are looking to pass on Miami. And then in the event of an implosion of the ACC, it's the Big 12. If Miami has an opportunity to go to the Big 12, what is before we even get to the pros and the cons, the immediate reaction for you?
Obviously, in that scenario, the ACC is irrelevant. Yeah. And, the Big 12, they're doing a surprisingly good job at keeping themselves relevant, even though they're about to lose Texas and Oklahoma, right? Yeah. Which is not an easy, that in certain situations that could have been a death blow. They're doing a pretty good job bringing in some new teams and markets, and they're going to get more ambitious, obviously, if teams from the ACC would come available. So I think there'd be a sense of relief. I'm not going to lie, there would be a small sense of disappointment if Miami doesn't land in one of the two super conferences, right? Because, the Big 12 is not, quite in that same conversation, at least when it comes to reputation of the teams that are in those conferences. But I think there would be a sense of relief to get out of the ACC, because Miami and most of the universities have not been too happy in the Atlantic Coast Conference. I think there would be some sense of relief there. And listen, obviously, if a handful of ACC teams end up in the Big 12, which is already a pretty good conference, I think it could end up being a lot of fun.
Well, Dono, after reading the comments on your video, I see a lot of Miami fans really hate the idea of even being associated with the words Big and 12. Let's go there next. But first, we hear from our valued sponsors at eBay Motors right here on Locked On Big 12 and Locked On Canes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. eBay Motors keeps your ride or die alive. Passion, drive, and patience, that brings home the winning trophy and is also what keeps that car alive. eBay Motors has everything you need. I wrecked my vehicle like 6 months ago and a year ago and 3 years ago. My insurance agent hates me. Luckily now, I don't have to call my insurance agent too often because I can just replace it with stuff from eBay Motors. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. 122 million parts. Guaranteed fit. It is guaranteed to fit, because with eBay Motors, you are burning rubber, not cash. All the parts, all the prices that you want. Easy to turn your car into the MVP, bring home the win. Keep your ride or die alive. ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit. Only available to U.S. customers. That is ebaymotors.com. All right, Dono, it was me taking the ad read reins there for the first time in a while.
I enjoyed that. For a second, I wasn't sure. Does he want me to read this or is he going to read it?
Oh, that would have been great. Look, having heard a lot of Miami fans very upset to be associated with the Big 12, give me those cons. What makes this so disgusting to some Miami fans?
Well, okay, the first thing is this goes back to what we were just covering. If Miami were to be left out of an opportunity to join the SEC or the Big Ten, that would be a bit of a body blow to Miami fans. Like, okay, how come the super conferences don't want us, or why don't we want to be part of that? Because obviously those would be the richest opportunities you would have to not be left out of the higher seeds in the college football playoff. I say it that way because we're expanding to 12 teams from now on. Right. So you're not going to have another Florida State scenario, but you may get a worse seed than you thought you were going to get, or you might be number 13 when you thought you were number 12. So there are other issues that can arise. So I think there would definitely be a big sense of disappointment. And when I brought up the Big 12 last week on my show, a lot of those negative comments were like, wait, that conference, that's not the SEC, that's not the Big Ten. Why would you even bring this up? Those are some of the cons. I also think that there is a legitimate fear of losing out potentially on a Florida State rivalry. I mean, that's been a yearly thing, even predating the two teams being in the same conference. Because when Miami was in the Big East and Florida was in the Florida State was in the ACC, they would still play annually. But if Florida State were to join the SEC and the Big Ten, there's the fear that rivalry may no longer be an annual thing, the way that the Florida rivalry has not been an annual thing since, I think, the late 1980s. That used to be a yearly thing between Miami and Florida. So the fear of, going into a new conference and the geography we'll talk about the reasons why it's a good thing. Geography would make sense, but losing out on traditional rivalries, I think, would be something that would worry Hurricanes fans. And listen, I think that the Big 12 roster is better than a lot of Miami fans give it credit for, but you don't see some of the traditional powers like the Bamas and the Ohio States and the Michigans and the Georgias. They don't turn up in the Big 12 roster. So I think that a lot of the negative comments we got span back to that stuff.
Dono, how much of this is fear of being left behind or considered little brother? If a Florida State goes to the Big Ten or Clemson goes to the SEC or UNC, Virginia, say those four teams or another assortment of schools get the offer to the two big leagues, and Miami is almost stuck with the Big 12. Is there a fear to be left behind when those teams get to go play with the big boys?
The biggest fear would be getting left behind in a lesser ACC. I think most Miami fans would prefer, if you're able to go to the Big 12, they'd probably prefer that opportunity. If you get left behind in like an 8 or 9 team ACC, obviously they would add more. Like they would pull up some group of 5 teams. So the way that they're bringing in SMU, and they're adding the the Pac-12 cast-offs, and Stanford and Cal are coming in. So I'm sure the ACC would try to grab more teams if they were to lose the Florida States and the Clemsons of the world. But I think the biggest fear would be you get left behind in an ACC that's no longer relevant, right? Yes. Because if you lose Florida State and Clemson and UNC and a handful of others, and it's like, what is there left? Like, could we go undefeated like Florida State just did and miss out on a 12-team playoff if we're stuck behind? Because part of the other issue, Drake, that people don't talk about enough is, if these super conferences are getting built around you and you're not part of one of them, you can't just schedule a great non-conference schedule, because the conference schedules are so loaded that they're not going to want to put you on their schedule, right? Like, everyone talks about, people who are older than you and even way older than me will talk about how great it was when Miami was independent back in the 80s, when they weren't part of a conference, and week to week they would be playing great teams that are now part of the Big Tens and the SECs, and like, we don't need to be in a conference, we'll load up the schedule. But it's like, it doesn't work that way anymore, because now that you have super conferences, they're not going to say, oh yeah, we got an open date, let's play Miami. It's just not going to work that way. So you need to be part of one of these conferences. I think getting left behind and being in a much lesser ACC, I think that would be the biggest fear.
Donna, we have not been near as pessimistic about the Big 12 as I thought we would get right here. And the next question isn't going to steer you in a pessimistic direction either. It sounds more like Miami being left out of the SEC and the Big Ten. The worst part of that is the left out part, more so than it is anything about the Big 12.
Obviously I can't speak for everyone. And in you saying that, you'll probably now get flooded with comments from Miami fans like, we don't want to be part of your trash conference. But I don't know, man.
The truck stop or whatever it is. Right.
Yeah, I think I speak for most when I say, because Miami fans don't like being in the ACC, even in the current form. Right. Yeah. And I know the jokes write themselves. Well, you've never won that terrible comp. Yes, Miami's never won the ACC. I get it. But they don't like being part of the conference to begin with. OK, I think I speak for most when I say getting left behind in a lesser ACC would be an even bigger fear, because, hey, at least the Big 12, would offer you something new and would offer you, opportunity to build some new rivalries. I don't think it would be the worst thing in the world.
Good. I like it. See, that's positive, Donna. This is more positive than we were supposed to be. I'll end it here. We'll see if we can get just an ounce of negative out of you here. Give me your bust. What? If that's just it, if you had to give the thesis, what is the problem with the Big 12 for a lot of these Miami fans?
Just like, okay, you look down the roster, and I don't think any Miami fan would care about playing Oklahoma State or Kansas State or Kansas or Iowa State. Like here, Cincinnati. I know Cincinnati's been an up and coming program, but it's just it's not going to move the needle for Miami fans. So it's like you look at that, where you look at the Big Ten and the SEC rosters, and outside of a couple of teams like the Vanderbilts of the world, whatever, it's a murderer's row when you look down those conferences, which is a good and bad thing, right? I mean, you're more likely to go 5-7 with a schedule like that, but you're also not as likely to get fans out to your stadium, because that's another big thing, Drake. And if people who are outside of Miami will always bring up, hey, look how empty that stadium is for most games, and your attendance is poor. You've got a much better chance of filling up the stadium if you're playing an SEC home schedule or a Big Ten home schedule, versus a Big 12 schedule. So I just think that the name value and the perceived strength of schedule, I say perceived because you've talked so well on your show about the Texas strength of schedule versus the Florida State strengths of schedule. So it's not really what fans necessarily perceive it to be. But I just think that the name value of the opponents is something, it doesn't get people very excited.
Yeah. And even on that note, Texas couldn't play Texas, right? Their strength of schedule didn't look as strong as other Big 12 teams because they didn't get the playoff team, the top 10 team, yet they still, with a loss in conference play, made it to the college football playoff, which is a good nod for the Big 12 and makes me think some Miami fans can be excited about a possible move to the conference. Dono, let's go there next, right here on the Locked On Big 12, Locked On Canes crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Talent Solutions. LinkedIn is where I go when I need to make a hire. I hire an intern almost every semester, usually from Baylor University, right in my backyard here in Waco. But this next semester, Baylor's not hiring. So what do? I go to LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which make it the best place to hire. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Whether it's an intern or a full-time position, LinkedIn knows that you're wearing so many hats. They help you with the process, make it intuitive, quick, and easy, even help you write your job description. So right now, post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. You can post your job for free. Keep in mind, terms and conditions do apply. That is LinkedIn Talent Solutions. All right, Dono, why should Miami fans like the Big 12?
Okay. The first part of this is not necessarily Big 12 specific. Okay. But I think two of the more important things that I look at in a potential conference realignment scenario, the most important thing in my eyes is, are you getting a bigger revenue share? Because that's one of the chief complaints with the ACC. And from everything I know about the ACC grant of rights versus the Big 12, if I'm not mistaken, Big 12 member schools, and obviously if more teams join the conference, this could change. Maybe the deal could be renegotiated, but Big 12 schools right now earn more annually, about $8 million more annually per member than the ACC does. The ACC
than Florida State. Miami and Clemson. Yeah.
Yeah. So ACC members currently make an approximated $23.3 million annually. In the Big 12, it's currently 31.7. So not as high as the SEC and the Big 10, but it's still significantly higher than the ACC. So you have to start there because, Drake, when these talks about Florida State and Clemson and Miami, allegedly being unhappy in the ACC, before we ever had these conversations about Florida State getting left out of the CFP, because that just happened a couple weeks ago. The conversations were, why aren't these schools making more money? And why did you get locked into this terrible grant of rights that, you've been lapped by every other major conference outside of the Pac-12, obviously, but you've been lapped by everybody else. So I start there. Can you earn more TV revenue at a different spot? That's the first place I start. And then, of course, the second place you have to go to, some might even put this first, does this other conference give you a better chance of getting into the college football playoff? Now, obviously, even despite what just happened to Florida State, that is debatable because I know Texas got in and they didn't, but then you'd say, well, if Jordan Travis hadn't been injured, Florida State would have gotten in too, and yada, yada, yada. But if a bunch of teams leave the ACC, that would no longer be a factor because the ACC would get even weaker. So the first two things that I look at, higher share of revenue, better opportunity to get into the college football playoff. If the Big 12 in your scenario of the ACC imploding, that gives you a better chance to accomplish both of those things. I would be on board with that, and I think most people would. So I start there. Outside of other attractive reasons to join the Big 12. I got to put some lipstick on the pig here, okay? Again, because obviously it's not the SEC and it's not the Big 10. There would be some interesting scenarios. I know that obviously Miami fans do not consider UCF to be a rival, but at least there would be an in-state tie-in. You could play a team within the state. And, the old school fans out there who remember the Big East days wouldn't mind seeing West Virginia again. Because honestly, going back to the 90s, early 2000s, Morgantown is always a crazy place to play. The West Virginia fans are bonkers. I can remember talking to Ken Dorsey back in the day, and he would say, that was the most difficult road environment because the people who show up to those games are just absolutely nuts. So that would be an interesting old rivalry to revive. And then, you'd have an opportunity to make some new rivalries.
The money aspect of this, Dono, because I'm so glad you brought that up. That's the reason I think Florida State is gone within the year, because they are worth so much more than they're getting from the ACC. And the current grant of rights is not scaled to pay them more. They are stuck. They are stuck. So I know the big brands, the power brands, Miami included, are at least talking about options past the ACC. With the Big 12, where the money is, how much of that truly is a factor in this? Because to me, it all revolves around the dough. Is that what's going to push Miami in this conversation? And really, from a revenue standpoint from Miami, does the university make enough to make a case for the Big 10 or the SEC, or are they Big 12 bound by virtue of cash?
No, I see. There's a couple different ways to look at that.
I asked you 6 questions in one.
Yeah,
Good luck.
Good luck. Thank you for that. The conversation in Miami has changed over the last couple of years. There has been a concerted effort of donors coming together because there's been a lot of money in Miami, and even if people aren't necessarily alumni, Miami kind of was the community team, right? A small alumni based private institution, but it's a team that's been in a university that's been embraced by the city. So some of Miami's biggest donors are people with FIU diplomas, but they love Miami. But the money's been coming together in the last couple of years. Miami owns a hospital system, one of the most prominent hospital systems in South Florida, that has become a cash cow over the past 4 or 5 years. So the money has been coming in a way donated towards athletics over the last 2 or 3 years that it just wasn't before. Yep. And, there's been a kind of a change of attitude because Miami for many years did things on a shoestring budget, right? Oftentimes, if you're thinking about which head coach to hire, well, who's a cheaper option that maybe we can win with? They're paying Mario Cristobal a lot of money, okay? And they're paying his assistant coaches a lot of money, and they put a lot of resources and money into, private jet access for recruiting and that sort of stuff that they just didn't used to do. Now, one of the things that, I think they're obviously, I'm sure for, the SEC and the Big Ten, there are pros and cons to adding Miami. One thing that's a definite pro that I'm sure the Big 12 would be interested in, it's a top 12 television market in the country, which is uncommon, right? Because, a lot of the top SEC programs are in tiny regional TV markets. They rely on a lot of national television ratings and traffic, where you've got a very large built-in television market with Miami. I'm sure that's something that would be attractive and a pro for any of these conferences. So there's definitely an opportunity. I know that for the Big Ten, for example, they were very eager to go grab USC and UCLA because LA is like a top 3 or a top 5 market, whatever it is, and they wanted to lock that in place. That may be one of the reasons why South Florida could be attractive for them.
Donna, before we close up shop, I want to ask you to editorialize. Would you be happy with a move to the Big 12?
Oh, that's
yeah.
This might be the most negative that I got in a question that may not have intended that kind of response. I think if there's a scenario when the ACC is no longer relevant, I could talk myself into the Big 12 is a better alternative than going down with a sinking ship, right? Because how can you stay relevant with a bad TV split? And if Florida State and Clemson are gone, and North Carolina, maybe Duke, if they're all gone, then what are you still hanging around for? Okay. Yeah. I would definitely be disappointed if Miami didn't get the opportunity to land in the Big Ten or in the SEC. I mean, I would love to be in the SEC. Just the I know it's tough to win in that conference, but just the opportunity to play that sort of a schedule as someone who covers the team and broadcasts on games, I think that would be really enjoyable. So the Big 12 would not be the scenario that would make me happiest. But I could be satisfied with that because, again, so much of what Miami is trying to focus on right now is internal, right? Because it's been an athletic department that has really gotten in their own way for so long. For the better part of the last 20 years, they've gotten in their own way with mismanagement and not allocating enough funds to improve their facilities, which is something they're doing now, and improve the quality of the coaches that they hire. So, as long as you get into a spot where you get better TV revenue and an opportunity to make it to the college football playoffs when you have, double-digit wins, I think that's something that could make me somewhat happy and satisfied.
I love it. Which is already a lot better than Utah fans feel because they're trying to find a different conference that's not the Big 12 so they can avoid BYU. So already BYU fans love, or Big 12 fans love Miami fans just because of your very neutral response to that, Dono.
And honestly, that's what it is, because it's like, it wouldn't be something that would make me jump up and down, but also it's like, hey, it's not a bad ACC either.
Yeah. No, I mean, there is. And for us in the Big 12 to see the way the conference has grown past losing Texas and OU, and to know that the opportunity is there to be in a driver's seat if the ACC falls apart is a good spot to be in and can be rebuilt into a power conference that at least salvages money, which is what this is all about. So, Donna, where can folks find you? Locked On Big 12 listeners who like your stuff.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, well, you included both of my X accounts down below.
Because I know you operate them both so well, Don.
I do. Well, I mean, I try to anyway. You can follow my personal at Alex Dono. You can follow the show at Locked On Canes. I tend to keep most of my show-specific stuff on the Locked On Canes handle. And yeah, check out Locked On Canes. Every now and then we talk conference realignment, but this week we're talking mostly recruiting and transfer portal because it just never stops. There's always some good or bad. There's always something happening this week. So yeah, find the show wherever you get your podcasts.
For Alex Dono, I'm Drake Toll. Thanks for making our shows your first listen every single day. This has been a crossover of Locked On Canes and Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.